Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're digging into a case that is absolutely not your average campfire tale. No, we're talking about a rigorously recorded anomaly, complete with military routing notes and signed police statements. We're diving into one of the most thoroughly documented anomalous events in American history.
So let's kick things off by asking a pretty fundamental question about credibility and really institutional pressure. What actually happens when trained observers, people whose entire careers depend on their reliability, report something that completely defies conventional explanation? Well, the Exeter Incident is a literal masterclass in how human testimony behaves when it's cross-examined by sheer authority.
Part 1. The Night Exeter Turned Red, September 3, 1965.
If you trace the timeline of that night, it's wild how fast things escalated. Within just a little over an hour, a teenager's frantic 2 a.m. report turned into a fully corroborated, multi-officer event by 3:17 a.m. This rapid escalation fundamentally changed the gravity of the whole situation. It pulled the event right out of the realm of, just a single frightened witness and dropped it squarely into the lap of local law enforcement.
18-year-old Norman Muscarello wasn't just casually observing a distant light while hitchhiking along Route 150. He was absolutely terrified by something massive at incredibly close range. He reported that this object came up on him so suddenly and intensely that he literally threw himself into a ditch just to avoid being struck.
And he wasn't reporting some blurry dot in the sky either. He detailed a highly structured, colossal craft. We are talking roughly 80 to 90 feet across. It hovered completely silently, barely above the tree line at about 100 feet in the air, and it flooded the entire area with this brilliant, intense red light.
And here is where it gets really strange. The lights didn't just flicker randomly. They pulsed in this highly engineered, machine-like sequence, deliberately counting 1 to 5 and then 5 to 1. I mean, natural atmospheric phenomena simply do not operate with that kind of mechanical precision. It was an unmistakable repeating pattern.
Part 2. Police arrive at the scene, corroborating the unbelievable.
Now, Officer Eugene Bertrand was not a guy who spooked easily. He was an Air Force veteran. He'd served with KC-97 tankers during the Korean War. A very seasoned, practical guy. Actually, he had dealt with a distressed motorist reporting a UFO earlier that very same night, found nothing, and just moved on. But taking Muscarello back to that farm, that changed everything.
Hearing an experienced, level-headed officer literally screaming in panic over the police radio completely shifted the vibe back at the station. The dispatcher that night, Scratch Toland, later noted that he had never heard Officer Bertrand yell like that before, and he never heard it again. The sheer shock in his voice was just palpable.
Out of the farm, this veteran officer actually dropped straight into the dirt and reached for his service weapon. Backed up by a second officer, David Hunt, they watched this silent craft cause horses in the nearby corral to kick and bray in sheer panic, right before it finally fluttered away toward the ocean.
Part 3. The Pentagon's explanation problem. Authority versus reality.
Project Blue Book had this monumental, frankly almost impossible task of translating these raw, terrifying events into neat, non-threatening little categories. At a time of intense national anxiety about foreign technology and airspace security, their primary goal often seemed to be, mitigating public panic rather than doing deep scientific inquiry.
The mismatch here is it's wild. The Air Force actually tried to blame a high-altitude military exercise called Operation Big Blast, mixed with twinkling stars and a temperature inversion. But come on, as any logical person knows, twinkling stars do not hover at treetop level and force veteran police officers to draw their weapons.
But the officers? They pushed back hard. They essentially risked their entire professional reputations because they flat-out refused to let what they lived through be swept under the rug. In a formal letter, they pointed out the sheer absurdity of the official explanation. They knew the difference between a distant star and a massive, silent craft hovering 100 feet away.
And amazingly, it worked. The documentary record shows an institutional desire to just end the story, but the steadfast witnesses forced the system to admit it simply didn't know. The Air Force formally backtracked. It is an incredibly rare moment where ground-level testimony from local law enforcement successfully challenged and overturned a Pentagon narrative.
Part 4. Stress testing alternative theories. The KC-97 tanker.
Now, to be fair, we absolutely have to look at alternative theories. In 2011, skeptics proposed a really compelling idea. They grabbed onto that specific mechanical 1 to 5 light sequence and offered a real-world system that could generate it. A KC-97 tanker has a series of 5 red lights on its belly for nighttime refueling, and the boom hanging down could potentially mimic the fluttering motion the witnesses reported.
It's a neat theory, right? But when you really look at the data, the friction is still there. An airplane does not hover silently at 100 feet. Plus, internal Air Force records checked during the initial investigation confirmed there was zero, literally zero, aerial refueling operations scheduled in the New England area that night. So the theory just kind of collapses against the facts.
And you know, Exeter absolutely was not an isolated incident. 667. That is the staggering number of UFO sightings left completely unexplained by the Air Force as of 1965. There was a massive wave of global sightings that year, and despite the government's best efforts to dismiss them, hundreds of cases, many from technical experts and pilots, simply could not be filed away neatly.
Part 5. Exeter's Lasting Cultural Legacy, From Stigma to Civic Pride.
So, what happens next? Well, investigative journalism quickly thrust this case into the national spotlight. John G. Fuller's meticulous book became a bestseller. The case reached 1966 congressional hearings, and through it all, Norman Muscarello lived his entire life, never once wavering from what he saw that night.
It's funny how things change. What started out as a moment of pure institutional panic has actually evolved into this massive community celebration. Today, thousands gather yearly. And ironically, the very same police department that once fought tooth and nail for its credibility now leans into it, selling commemorative UFO patches to fund their community comfort dog program. So, what does the Exeter incident really tell us about the friction between our lived experiences and the official narratives we're handed? I want to leave you with that thought to ponder as we close out today's explainer on the remarkable events of 1965. This isn't just about lights in the sky. It's a profound look at human credibility, the courage to stand by your truth, and the enduring friction between what we experience firsthand and what authorities tell us we saw. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning and keep exploring.